was only one person per square mile, so it was just very, very, very remote. Here is a picture from the Denver Public Library of, I think this is an early ranch in Grand County, again with the horses and a woman riding side saddle. So another interesting thing is women really used to ride side saddle, even if they were out on the ranches, riding the way the men rode with their legs on, in the stirrups on either side of the horse was called riding slick. So it's just interesting to see this. Let's see, so originally in the Western United States, Colorado is not alone in this. The Homestead Act was established in 1862, and it originally offered 160 acres per settling family or per settler. These acres had to be proved up, meaning there had to be a structure built. It didn't have to be the best structure. Irrigation would be a method to prove something up. You basically had to improve just the rough land and try to get it ready for agriculture or try to get it ready for stock, just to be doing something with it. The Desert Land Act came along afterwards on March 3rd, 1877, and this originally offered up to 640 acres, but it was decreased down to 320. During 1877 through 1887, this act was largely used by cattlemen. There wasn't a residence requirement, and there were a lot of abuses. During 1888 to 1893, the abuses dropped, meaning the cattlemen used to go in and they would hire townspeople or whatever to file on claims for them, pay them for their trouble, and they would get all this extra land for basically no money. When the abuses dropped, there was stricter regulations and checks for irrigation systems. Then in 1878 came the Timber and Stone Act, and this people had to purchase a $2.50 per acre and 160 acre parcels. So the trick to get this cheap land under the Timber and Stone Act was to get the land declared unfit for agriculture. Speculators were able to get large expanses against just by basically knowing the person who was recording the deeds, falsifying records, basically kind of swindling the government at this point. Many purchasers of these 160 acres deeded them back to the large holders, and the large holders became larger. Here is a picture of just cattle, and there's people who are looking over their herds, but this is just kind of gives a good feeling for just how vast herds could be. They would just stretch, for very large distances. Cattlemen on the plains were using and abusing the various statutes soon after they were passed. The first stockmen who arrived into Colorado and Wyoming were attracted by the alleged easy wealth and the liberal federal land policies, and they really had the determination to, quote, cash in on the beef bonanza. They weren't concerned with bending the law if they needed something or wanted something, or even just if the opportunity arose. After they would preempt on or homestead on a ranch site, they usually would take over, if they could, adjacent range. As all the usable lands became filled, competition for the remaining unsettled land really did become intense. So then the stockmen would file under the Timber, Culture, and Desert Land Act so that they could better control especially water, because water has always been a precious commodity out here. So if a cattleman could dominate the source of water, they could dominate all that range around it. So probably everybody knows the story of Cattle Kate up in Wyoming, who was, I don't know if she was a legal wife or a common law wife to Jim Averill, who ran a post office up there. And they had two 160-acre homestead lots. She homesteaded on her own, he homesteaded on his home, and the lots were co-located. They also were able to control water, and this situation led to the larger cattle concerns being upset by these smaller homesteading people, or nesters, they would call them. They actually strung up Cattle Kate, or her real name was, gosh darn, it's just going on in my head. They strung her up and her husband, killing them, saying they were rustlers when these people had done nothing at all wrong. What they really wanted were their water access and lands. So anyhow, to fulfill the requirements of the law to use these areas of land, a popular trick was to construct an, quote, an irrigation ditch by dragging a pointed stick behind a plow. Well, that's, that's not really how you deal with irrigation ditches. Another trick would be to dump a barrel of water on the ground and call it irrigated. So obviously, like, whoever was witnessing this was in on kind of the swindle here for land. Federal authorities had knowledge of these problems, but they felt powerless to stop them, once again, largely due to the remoteness of Colorado and Wyoming and the ranches that they were establishing. However, changes in the legislation were made in the 1890s. And here's a picture by William Henry Jackson. He is one of Colorado. I think he's probably actually from Connecticut, but he traveled around the West, and he's left us some of our most iconic images. And this just happens to be one of his photographs that he took of a Colorado ranch. So in the 1860s and the 1870s, rustling wasn't a major problem because there was a limited number of ways to dispose of the cattle, because we didn't really have railroads out here yet. So, however, as time progressed and a marketing network developed, largely due to the new railroads, livestock theft started to increase. Rustlers found it easy to change cattle brands on the open range, which is known as venting. And what they would do is they would have something called a running rod, or even just a saddle ring that was a curved one. A running rod would be straight, saddle ring would be curved. And if you heated these up in a fire, you could alter brands on hides. And so when I was starting to do some of the work on the bad old days of Colorado, I was pretty interested in the outlaw culture up in Northwest Colorado. And I went up there and I was talking to some ranchers, and I'm like, well, it's really sometimes hard to see if a brand has been changed. And they're like, yes. And I'm like, but I've heard if the animal dies and you take the skin off of them, you can see what the original brand was deeper in. And that is actually how some people used to be arrested, is the stock detectives would go through their outer buildings, and they might find some of these vented hides. And this was usually enough to get a conviction of it. Horse stealing was considered a more serious crime than cattle theft, especially if the horse theft happened leaving a person without transportation in the middle of the wilderness. It's kind of like almost a death sentence if you left somebody, 300 miles from town. There's not water, and they have no way to get anywhere, and they may not even know 100% where they're going. It's very dangerous. However, cattle rustling actually cost the cattlemen more than horse theft did. One interesting thing about how Colorado deals with brands and livestock and the branding of them really stems back from about the 1870s with Dave Cook, and it continues into the modern era. We still have rustling, cattle rustling. You guys may have seen in the newspapers, like 30 head recently was stolen off of some ranch. Gosh darn, maybe it was in Aurora. Horses get stolen. This all still happens. But when cattle rustling started becoming predominant, Dave Cook, which you guys might know, the Dave Cook sporting goods stores. Well, Dave Cook was a sheriff and the founder of the Rocky Mountain Detective Association in Denver. The Cattlemen's Association hired him as one of the members of their board. And I guess he was kind of a quiet guy in the beginning and he didn't know all that much, but he kept meticulous records. And what was really interesting is Cook not only tracked criminals involved with cattle or horse theft, he also started a central information exchange to aid other private eyes or people working on rustling cases. Cook convinced the Stock Growers Association that the best way to solve the rustling problem was to make it difficult for rustlers to dispose of these animals. To do that, a system of market and stockyard observers was created at all of the major shipping points to check brands and registrations. Cook's solution worked well, and in the 1890s, rustling throughout Colorado was nearly eliminated. And this, the system is largely in place today. But back to the Colorado stock growers, when he started his research into all the thefts that were taking place, some of the men who were leading on the Colorado Stock Growers Associations were criminals themselves. And so when he read through all their records and he went out and he looked at their ranches and looked at their brands, he's like, well, I have enough to convict some of you who are sitting on the board. And we're talking about like getting rustling under control. So they all resigned, except for like the ones who weren't guilty of anything. But it was kind of interesting that the theft with people were so pronounced that people who were like some of the greatest offenders were the people who were running the stock growers associations. It's pretty bad. Let's see, let's get this going. So I don't know if you all know how to read brands, but here are some kind of simple characters. You read from left to right, from the top down, and from the outside into the inside. Okay, so just depending on like what we're looking at. I was going to bring in a couple of branding irons, and I guess I should have brought them up from the basement, but here we can go through some of this if you guys know how to read brands.
And I'm just going to mention, there should be a little button at the top if you're having trouble seeing the images, that there is a little plus button that you can zoom in on the presentation.
Okay. Oh, look at that. Okay, thank you. So the first character is a reverse F. So that just happens to be what it is. So a lot of times they will reverse letters, and it's just a different way to show a character. Tumbling A is when something looks like it's about to fall over. It's always read as tumbling. Lazy Z or a lazy anything is basically the alphabet letter laying on its back. This next one would be, would be a flying R because it has these two tildes or wings on either side. Here's an example of a walking A because of these two figures that it has like at the feet. Rocking 4 just has like a U put under whatever you needed. It could be rocking 2, whatever. Here's a diamond is a very typical sign. A diamond F has a diamond with an F hanging underneath. Rocking chair is also popular. And in my dark range series, I kind of wanted an own brand, and the family's name is Cross. So what I did was Cross's Lost Daughter. So it's a cross that's also an L with a hanging D underneath. So that's kind of how, just a very rudimentary way to read brands. And then the more you string together, of course, the more damage it causes to the hide and the more painful it actually is for the animal. So every once in a while, somebody's like, oh, well, this was really great. They had a really huge brand with like all the alphabet in it. And I'm like going, that is really not great at all. But just saying. But, and here's Dave J. Cook. He was actually one of our good guys. Western lawman and the Denver City Marshal. He was actually credited, according to his son, who wrote a book that he his son wrote, and it is titled, hold on, which is actually kind of a fun read if you're interested in Denver city history. Hands Up are 35 years of detective life in the mountains. So maybe he had 3,000 arrests. That seems like an awful lot, but he was also, what I was saying, an early Brandon stock detective who had a very successful record. Before coming to becoming the city marshal, Cook worked as a farmhand in Kansas, and then he moved up to Gilpin County in 1859, like everybody else, looking for gold. In 1861, he joined the Colorado Cavalry during the Civil War and was assigned to conduct counter-espionage for the Union Army by tracking Confederate spies and investigating gold smuggling and other crimes. So we did have like Civil War tensions out here, as we all know. And so there was a plot by the Confederate Army to raid the gold fields. So when we're saying that he's investigating gold smuggling, I presume that was basically to support the Confederate Army. But anyhow, he was so good at this counter-espionage job, he eventually founded the Rocky Mountain Detective Association, which is a volunteer-only group of Colorado troubleshooters. They actually gave the Pinkertons sometimes a run for their money. Cook is credited with tracking down and arresting the leader of the Musgrove Franklin gang, which was a big event at the time. He also did go out to Golden and have arrests out there. So Golden, there used to be a train that would just go from Golden to Denver. So depending on what year it was, he'd either ride his horse out or he'd just get on the train and he'd come out to Golden and arrest who needed arrested and haul them back into Denver. It's kind of interesting to think about. Here is a brand book, just so you guys can see what one looks like. They show you where the brands would go, what brands they're using. In the middle here, these are earmarks. And this is who the brands are registered to. So every ranching family might just have one brand, or like this one here, the Prairie Cattle Company Limited. They might have several brands. Horse brands and cattle brands can be the same or they can be different. You know, and what's interesting, this one horse that I ride, he actually has two sets of brands because he was obviously raised in one ranch, got sold on to another ranch, rebranded. Now the lady that I ride him for did not brand him a third time, but that's why you have to have transportation papers, and why brand inspectors will always inspect the markings to make sure when somebody is selling on a horse or cattle that they own the cattle and they have title to that animal. So that is, again, a hangover or a continuation from the theory and the framework that Dave Cook put into place. Here's some more brand books. And here is roping a steer to inspect the brand. I don't know what year this was. This is coming from the Denver Public Library, but again, the photograph seems to have been taken from Cheyenne, Wyoming, based on this marking here. And this is like an old, this is like pictures of a very old brand book, probably from the 1870s. And they would take notes, the brand detectives or the brand inspectors, of what they were seeing, who the people were, you know, where they're putting their brands. It's a really interesting relic of history that we still actually use today. Here's a cowboy mount up. So the more horses or the more cattle you're running, the more cowboys you need to keep track of everything, because animals actually do wander off. If there's a storm and they get scared, they'll stampede. Horses are obviously much harder to capture than cattle because they move a lot faster. So it would depend on what kind of outfit you were running as to the size of the cowboys you needed to help you with whatever you were doing. So locally, Golden used to really be surrounded by ranches, even to the point when I was growing up. I mean, the ranches were starting to get sold, but they were still there, definitely. And we had a really interesting lady who lived outside of the Mount Vernon Canyon stage stop. So Mount Vernon Canyon is still kind of like, that road up to Mother Cabrini Shrine where Mount Vernon Country Club is, all of that type of thing. But the stage stop was purchased in 1868 by an English woman named Louisa Gifford. And it was called the New York Ranch, and Louisa had it insured for quite a bit of money on it. So whether by design or otherwise, missing livestock with altered brands started turning up there, along with the rougher element lured by the gold of Central City and Gilpin County. So Louisa hired a young woman to work for her, a woman named Josie. And Josie really thought the newspapers claimed Josie was just a second Calamity Jane. I mean, she could shoot anything. She could cuss, she could spit, she could probably carry up, heavy calves, all that type of thing, a bigger than life person. But maybe she really wasn't so much. But anyhow, Mrs. Gifford also had two associates, one called Charlie Reinhold and the other was Bill Eugene Tunis. These were kind of considered very sketchy people. And in 1886, all three of them, Mrs. Gifford, Reinhold, and Tunis, were arrested on 7 counts of larceny. Each pled not guilty to whatever 7 counts were listed, but Guilford and Reinhold were found guilty. Tunis, you can't find him in the newspapers anymore, so he may have either escaped, which there's no mention of, or he received a separate trial. But anyhow, Gifford was sentenced to 1 year in Canyon City, and Reinhold was sentenced to 5 years hard labor at the penitentiary. But before long, the two were on bail or bond, and the ranch that was highly insured was mysteriously burnt down. So the insurance company had their suspicions about all of this, and they sent out a handsome young investigator. And the only person who was left was Josie working out there, and she meets this handsome young guy, and she figures herself in love with the young guy. And it kind of, you can kind of figure out what happened. She fell in love with the guy. He asked her questions, and she told them everything. So that is kind of an interesting story there. And so it didn't work out too well for them. What is interesting in this book that I was just talking to Kathleen about, I just found it last month. It's called Class and Community in Frontier, Colorado, and it has a large segment of Golden, Colorado, and how Golden organized, and basically who was living in the town, what were the most important features of how they settled the town. And interestingly enough, Golden was very much for law and order. So the fact that Tunis isn't mentioned and may have escaped separate trial, upon reading this book, I kind of understand it a little bit more. So whereas Denver was kind of more a wild open town, they'd put anything in their newspapers. Golden tried to protect the bad news a little bit because they were really trying to attract families into town, stable people, artisans. So if word got out that like a guy who was like stealing horses escaped, it didn't behoove the Golden newspapers to really publish that much about it. So Golden used to like relish Denver's shortcomings and vice versa, because we were both in competition for the territorial capital, as everybody knows. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that a man would just disappear, but yep, that happened. Here is a ranch in Middle Park on the Grand River. Again, ranches, you can see from this right here, it's not a very fancy place to live. These are very kind of hard, scrappy places. It was, it was a lot of work, obviously, to run a ranch. This is a group from Colorado's outlaw territory, basically in Moffat County now. This is a group of men in Browns Park prior to 1900. As you will see right here, this man here is Isom Dart. He was, this picture is believed to have been taken by Josie Bassett, one of the Bassett family members that we'll talk about a little bit here. So what happened up there? The sheer violence happening in Browns Park was remarkable. So when I started working in the bad old days of Colorado, and I was looking, Colorado's historic newspapers is a great source. I would write in like rustler or shooting, and I would see what popped up, and you can sort it by year. And all of a sudden, I started seeing all this stuff on Browns Park, and I didn't even know where Browns Park was. I'm like, what in God's name are these people doing up there? It was just rough. So they have a little cemetery up there. I've been up there several times. I would say maybe there's like 20 graves, and I would say I know for a fact that at least about 17 or 18 out of those 20 graves died from violence. Okay, so violence was off the chart. This young man here, his name was Jack Rollis. He died in 1882 working for the Bassett family. So what happened was the Bassets and a lot of the people up there used to have checkered backgrounds, shall we say. They often wouldn't slaughter their own beef for food. They said, only dudes eat their own beef for dinner, meaning they would, if somebody else's cow came through or steer came through and they thought they could get away with it, they would butcher the steer and eat it. So the whole problem up there became when was the line getting crossed, because they were very much all into the same community. They all knew the rules. So where do bad things happen? Anyhow, Jack Rollis was out in the corral working on some horses. Some riders came up from Texas, all the way up from Texas, and this isn't a short trip there, stopped at the Bassett house and said, do you know Jack Rollis? And they're like, yes. And they're like, well, where is he? And they're like, he's in the corral working on the horses. Well, they shot him in the back, reportedly because somebody's sister in this group, I don't know, maybe he disappointed her or jolted her at the altar, but what they did is they shot Jack Rollis. They carried Jack into the family's house, bleeding profusely. It was obvious he was going to die. The mother of the family managed to corner these three men with some of the help of her daughters and a cook there. And she paraded them into the man's room as he's bleeding out, saying, shoot them now. You can shoot whatever one you want. And he declined to shoot any of them, but this was just the type of violence. So the three Texans who rode in, nothing much happened to them at that moment. When the men came in, they actually ended up springing some of the men up on the crossbeam of the family ranch, right? So once again, this is, it's very rustic justice. We can say the reason why they would take matters into their own hands so strongly was to get to Hans Peak, which was the county seat at that time, was actually a 2-day horse ride to get any help. Also with Browns County, it's attached to our neighbors, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. They didn't know where the boundary between Colorado and Utah was for the longest time. So any crimes committed or any outlaws that came into the area, they would just cross over the supposed border. Posses weren't supposed to cross state lines, so a new posse would have to be gathered together to chase the outlaws, which tilted the odds very much in the outlaws' favors. Here is one of the cattle barons' ranches out in Browns Park. His name was Ora Haley. He had huge holdings in Wyoming, and this Browns Park region was actually a very good area to winter your cattle in the winter months. And so what was happening was there were already existing small holders here that got their land off of the Homestead Act. Maybe they hadn't filed for their claims, even though they'd worked them for 5 years because of the 2-day ride to Hans Park and 2 days back. So that's 4 days to file a claim. Well, these cattle barons came in and pushed the people off the land that they had worked. They had lawyers, they knew what they were doing. And all of a sudden, what pitted was the large cattle holders versus the small cattle holders. In comes Anne Bassett Willis, called at the time Queen Anne. She was engaged to this man, Matt Rash, here in the middle, who was the head of the Small Growers Stockmen's Association. He was assassinated perhaps by Tom Horn. So most history people have heard of Tom Horn, who killed several people. Tom Horn was hired on the Bassett's ranch. They thought it was very odd because he really couldn't do cattle work, but he was good at shooting and riding horses. So when the story goes that Anne Bassett was engaged to Matt Rash was killed supposedly because Mash was a rustler. Queen Anne at that point, or just known as Anne at that point, waged war against Ora Haley, the man who owned this ranch here, which was a large concern. And she used to, if she could find pockets of his cattle untended by cowboys, she would actually try to drive them off of cliffs or drown into the Green River or the Yampa River, which goes right through this landscape back here where that roof is. She was waging a one-woman battle against the cattle barons. Okay. So this is Todd Rash's cabin, and this is what, Matt Rash looked like. And in comes Isom Dart. Isom Dart was, I believe, a freed slave. Nobody really knows that much about his early days. However, he was a friend of Matt Rash's. He had his own ranch. He was also known as probably one of the best horsemen in northwestern Colorado, just a brilliant rider. But also, according to Tom Horn, he was a rustler. And so Tom Horn started putting notes, and if it wasn't Tom, it was somebody else in the district saying, we know you are a rustler, you need to leave town, leave the district. So Matt Rash got the warning on his house or cabin. Isom Dart got the warning on his cabin. Isom Dart was killed as well. So all of a sudden, people who were coming out of their cabin for whatever reason were actually being gunned down. And this really didn't set well at all. So this is just kind of a snapshot of like how life actually went out here. The reason why Anne Bassett became known as Queen Anne is she actually ended up defeating Ora Haley, the cattle baron, in court because she was very smart, beautiful, could ride like, ride like the wind. She was also pretty good at guessing basic people's human nature. So she hauled Ora Haley into court, claiming that he had more head of cattle on his land than he filed for or admitted. So, which while that doesn't seem like a big deal, you have to pay taxes on the head of cattle you own. So, the first trial they went through, it ended up in a hung jury. Nothing happened. Again, they came back into trial, and Anne Bassett actually managed to play Ora Haley well enough to say, that he admitted basically that he had underreported his cattle head, and he got fined based on taxes, sort of like Al Capone, as opposed to him killing her fiance. I've lost that. How is that possible? Instead of like being charged with the murder of Matt Rash or Isom Dart or hiring Tom Horn to do the assassinations for him, he was actually fined substantially for underreporting his taxes. So kind of a 20th century answer to a lot of this going on. And so that is basically my presentation on the larceny of livestock. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything.
I will allow everyone to unmute themselves. So you should now have the ability to unmute yourselves if you do have any questions. I did actually kind of have a question for you. Randy, were most ranches named after their brands, or were the brands named after the ranches? Because I'm thinking like the Flying W Ranch in the Springs.
Yeah, I think for the most part, well, it could be completely different, which makes it just really confusing. Their brand would be a brand that they would register. Hopefully, it would have some parallel to either their name or the ranch name, but they could be completely different. They could absolutely be completely different. So, probably I would say they would get their ranch first before they filed for their brands. Brands will go with the same family if they own. If they own a brand and it's been filed, they could buy new land, like, in Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Denver, Northwest, and they can take their brand with them. So all of a sudden you can have like the same brand in different pockets of the state, depending if they have multiple ranches. But yeah, the Flying W.
It's just recently reopened, so that's why I was thinking about it because I went as a kid, but
I know everybody went. That was fun. Like they had hay rides and stuff. And if you think about it, like the V-Bar Ranch up in Wyoming, that's a fairly well-known one. That's actually a dude ranch that used to be stagecoach stop and all of that. Their brand's pretty easy to read, and it goes. That one all lines up to the best of my knowledge. It's just the V-Bar, type of thing. But if we look at, if I go backwards, let's see if we can see one. Um, See, like here, so let's see, Greeley, Colorado. Brand same as cut, earmark. Says where the ranches are. Caprock Cattle Company. I don't know, Caprock would be a reasonable ranch name. Prairie Cattle Company Limited wouldn't really be a ranch name, for example, but here's their brands. Benkelman, horse brand, Lazy JC on the left shoulder. And that says horse brand, and that's kind of interesting because they're showing a picture of a steer there. So interesting. So yeah.
can brands be transferred? So like if someone, can they be sold, or is it kind of like if a family no longer ranches, it's just dead?
No, I've heard of people being gifted brands. So like if somebody, one man I know was gifted one of Wyoming's original brands, which was a big honor because he worked at this ranch. The couple didn't have children, and so they deeded him. So he inherited the brand. I think you could sell them if you wanted to. You would have to do paperwork. Trust me, the brand inspectors are all about paperwork now these days. They have to be. So yeah. And actually the brand office is just up really in North Glen. And I've heard that they have a huge like Rolodex file where you can just kind of search through and see like lots of old brands. I like looking at old brands. I don't know, but it's pretty cool.
Neat. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, well,
I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you, Randy and Kathleen, for putting this together. It was very interesting. We're transplants to Colorado, so we enjoyed it.
Where are you coming from?
Well, we're originally from Montana.
Oh, very nice. So you
Yeah.
know this stuff too. It's like Montana. I just finished a book. Gosh, it's going to come out in August. It's The Bad Old Days of Montana. They actually asked me to write it. So it's kind of fun just to look at like the Montana, because Montana had range problems like Stuart Stranglers and the Horse Thief War, all that type of thing. So I wrote a lot about that too. So, well, welcome down to Colorado. We're warmer.
A little bit, yeah. Well,
Not today, but
your winters don't last as long as the Montana ones. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
well, thank you for coming in.
Well, and I would say if anyone thinks of a question later, you're more than welcome to email me and I can pass it on to Randy. I will put my email in the chat and all of you should have it. I sent you the link. But obviously, if you think of something later, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send it over to Randy as well.
Cool.
So. And Randy, you do have a website if you want to share that.
Yeah, it's in the chat like a normal person.
I can do that too.
Okay, www.randysamuelson-brown, just one word.com.
So that way, if anyone is interested in any of your books, they can see what different things you have.
Yep. And I post a lot of like historical pictures or just random wanderings around the state. Montana's a great state for wandering too, so it's all good.
All right, well, thank you so much for presenting to us tonight. We really appreciate it. It was nice everyone got to stay nice and cozy and warm, so they didn't have to venture out in the cold.
Totally. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.